1. Hello, this is Matthew Shadburn, and I will be discussing my first affirmative constructive and second affirmative constructive with my friend from Scotland, Mikey Bernard.
What's up, man?
So the way that we write these for debates is we have a contention, which is basically why we're making this, why we're debating, and then a plan, and then it lists the advantages. So the contention is the inherency, like why this argument is being made. And so my inherency is implementation of reparations for African Americans in the United States is necessary for reconciliation of the atrocities committed against the Black community through slavery and its repercussions, such as Jim Crow laws and housing discrimination. And then the plan, it is necessary to implement partial reparations for the people of color community in the United States. So the way that a debate goes is you read your first affirmative constructive, and then the negative side, which you will be taking the role of, has their own things and their own counterpoints about what you're talking about. So I'll read my advantages, and then you talk about any of the problems that you would have with this being implemented. And then what I have to do for the second part of this assignment is preempt your counterpoints and have my counterpoints already lined up. So I'm just gonna read the rest of it, and then you respond as you would as the negative.
Okay.
Right? So first, I would establish a basis for reparations. About 600,000 slaves were transported to America, or 5% of the 12 million slaves taken from Africa. That's Millers and Smith 678. That's the citation for that. No one can deny the acts of slavery took place in the U.S., and estimates indicate that a fair reparation value anywhere between 1.4 to 4.7 trillion, or roughly $142,000 for every Black American living today. And that's a citation from the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. African Americans continue to face prejudice today, and reparations would allow the community to bring an end to systematic injustice they face daily. Additionally, economic historian Robert E. Wright argues that it would have been less expensive if the federal government had purchased and freed all the slaves rather than fighting in the Civil War. Finally, an article published by the American Humanist Association in 2008 argued that if emancipated slaves had been allowed to possess and retain the profits of their labor, their descendants might now control a larger share of American social and monetary wealth. My second point is about the American support for reparations. 59% of Black Americans support cash payouts to descendants of slaves, and 63% of Black Americans support special education and job training programs for the descendants of slaves. That's from a study by YouGov. This particular plan for reparations would give cash payments only to the descendants of slaves that can be proven, and only to the people that support it today. People of color that either cannot be traced back to victims of slavery in the United States or that do not support receiving cash payments as reparations will not receive them. The same to be said for special education and job training programs. This is to prevent economic and political strain on all communities. So that's what I have for my 1AC, as we call it. And now it would be open to cross-examination, and then you would say your points. But I guess the cross-examination and your own points are sort of the same thing. So now we're gonna, after the 1AC in a debate is the most structured thing there is. Like me and my debate partner, when we went into a argument that we were debating in favor of for, the first part you read it almost like a script, but then the negative side has to be much more adaptable in their arguments because they're not sure what they're arguing until very soon before the debate. And so now it would be up to you to say your counterpoints against this idea for the plan of implementing reparations. So what are some of your counterpoints, Mike?
Well, race is a very touchy subject, so I need to be careful what I say. But it's like you said, if there's no trace back to having relatives that were slaves, then people that are actually relatives but don't have the evidence to back it up, I feel like it's not really consistent.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there you go. What you said?
Because that would be an excellent counterpoint for the negatives, because there is no census data from that time that tracked who was a slave and who was not. So that would be as a negative. You would argue that very much, is we really have very little idea who can be the descendant of a slave and who cannot. And I think as an affirmative, to preempt that, I would say that. Oh, so that's another thing about the debate is, as you go on, like, you as a negative side would have really gotten me on that one, like, oh wow, yeah, we hadn't planned on then saying, like, well, how do you prove who is and who isn't? So then in our next one, we would tweak our plan to say, anyone that applies that is, more than 30% African American by DNA can apply for this reparation program, to circumnavigate your counterpoint of, well, how do we prove who was a slave and who wasn't? So that's there's a whole lot of sort of fourth dimensional chess in debating like that. Well, I planned on them planning that they would know that I would know, a whole lot of that. It's very interesting. So that would be the next tweak to the plan, would be not to just, strictly provable. Like, if you can say, if you have a suspicion that your ancestors were slaves, you can apply for reparations. So then what would be another counterpoint that you would say?
People taking advantage of it. People that don't have a clue if their relatives were slaves, but they hear money and they run for it. So it could waste a lot of time and resources only to just come back short.
That would be a good counterpoint that I could preempt by saying, is sort of appealing to emotion, like, oh well, I would say that 100 years of slavery sure wasted a lot of time. How much products of slavery are still around today? How many cotton shirts or cigarettes with tobacco that were farmed by slaves, how many of those around today? That seems like a waste of time, doesn't it, Mike? Sort of really going in on that emotion, and then say, I'll tell you what is bad that has stuck around from slavery, and then talk about Jim Crow laws and redlining and sort of the systematic racism that people of color face in America. So I would sort of take that idea of, like, well, it could be taken advantage of, and then totally turn it into an emotional thing, like, oh, you want to talk about being taken advantage, huh?
Yeah.
That would be a thing to do on the affirmative. In the second affirmative constructive, when I address what you say, it's like, well, my opponent talk about being taken advantage of. Well, we don't need to worry about some small sum of money being taken by a family that needs it. We need to address the problem of racism and the outcomes from slavery. So that's how you could address that in your second affirmative constructive. So then what would be another point?
Probably people not of African American race saying, well, why didn't we get compensation for this event that happened in this event? I feel like it could start a big argument over that.
That was one of, when I argued against reparations, that was one of my points. And this has a very simple answer. If this was a debate in this specific context, I could say, I have absolutely no obligation to answer that, because the topic of debate at hand today is talking about specifically African Americans. I don't need to address if we should, you good? If we should give reparations to American Indians, because that's not the topic of debate. So that's what you call an arguing on topicality. So if this was a real debate, that wouldn't even be something that you would even try and push, because I don't need any evidence, any citations, any effort more than saying to the judge, topicality, and then you move on. Anything else? Those were, I think, were my three arguments against it. One argument is that it's simply too much money. That because it's like $1 to $4 trillion. So I preempted that in my first affirmative constructive by saying, well, we're not talking about, $100,000 to every single, to 13% of the population. So I say that we do it in other ways, giving them exemption from property tax, which is a value of, I cited that somewhere, 787 billion, which is still a lot, but a far cry from 1 to 4 trillion, which would really negatively affect the American economy and every community, not just those that it sought to aid and those that are paying for it. But exemption from property tax is a good start financially, as well as a symbolic acknowledgement of the practices of redlining, which had to do with property and property values and who could buy property where.
Yeah.
And so my plan doesn't say the 1 to 4 trillion that it is actually valued at. It would be partial reparations. Another thing I said is government funded campaigns, basically. So say you grow up in Detroit and you want to be the mayor, but elections and campaigns are expensive. So there's this government funded agency that will allow you to take out ads in the newspaper and the television to campaign for local government offices.
Yeah.
You have any other counterpoints? I think we went through my points and your counterpoints. Yeah, do you have anything else? Any questions? Any questions about the debate format as a whole?
Yeah, how do the debates work?
So the the single debate that I've done, we pulled from a pool of evidence for all of our sources, and then everyone writes an affirmative speech that they are much more prepared for, and you research negatives on all the other topics. And so then you go to this debate, and if you're arguing in favor of it, you read your 1AC, and then the opposing team asks questions, and then they give their 1NC, so their uh, response to that, and then they get asked questions, and then this is I hope my professor doesn't really like examine this video, because I might get this wrong, because I was so nervous during my debate that I was just shooting from the hip most of the time. So then you do your second affirmative constructive, and then questions, and then they do theirs, and then there's rebuttals. So those are like the final words.
Mm.
Yeah, the debate structure is very complicated to me. Like it's definitely step by step. But you basically just go back and forth adapting your argument.
Mm.
But the most important thing is, I think, the first affirmative constructive, because that's the first word, and you can shut down a lot of the things that the negative team would say. You know, in my first debate, like, oh, the other team had a really good point about the you know, who was an ancestor and who wasn't. So then in my next debate, to shut down the next negative speakers, I work in a point about that.
Mm. Mm.
Any other questions? Would you be interested in a debate class or course or civic engagement of any kind?
I think I would if it was a topic I was passionate about.
That's something that that I was sort of stuck on as well. Was when we were negative, we had to argue in favor of like government control. So it was like, I don't believe this. I can't argue effectively, but that's how you sort of hone your skill as a debater, is debating things that you don't believe in at all.
Mm.
What sort of topic do you think that would be applicable to Scotland and Scottish government? Like, what would you see yourself debating?
Um, you've put me on the spot now.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure.
Something
Um,
about regulations, maybe?
maybe. Um, I'm not too much into the sort of political side of where I live, but yeah, if there was something over here that I feel like I was proper passionate about, then I'd definitely argue for it.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for joining me
No problem, man.
on
Thanks for.
this civic engagement. Do you feel like you were engaged civically?
I do.
I'm very happy to hear that. All right. Well, I will talk to you again soon. Thanks again
Talk to
for
you later.
joining me,
No
and
problem.
have a good night.
You too.